We're only going to get to that humanity 2.0 by using the very best of humanity 1.0. Which part of our current values do we want to uphold, and which part do we want to say, you know what, this is no longer appropriate in the new world, in the new society? That's quite a disturbing conversation to have at first, but we need to have the confidence to have that conversation. It's only with an awareness of the shadow that we can really move into the brilliance of the sunlight.
For episode 35, my guest is David Wood, who is the founder of London Futurists. As an entrepreneur and technologist who achieved success in the first wave of the mobile phone revolution, he is ahead of the curve and always thinking about the future, what is coming and how it will affect us. World-changing technology advances are going to be here in the very near future, from artificial intelligence to biotech. These technologies are going to change our lives, which means that we all need to be informed so we can understand the impact that they will have and make informed decisions. It seems that there are two potential future scenarios that are possible, and of course everything in between, from a super abundant future to a new dark age for humanity. It's going to come down to an issue of ethics and morality. I hope that you too find this conversation fascinating. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I'm delighted, David, to welcome you to my sofa. Welcome to the show.
I'm honoured to be here.
You started out with creating software for mobile phones, and at the time that was a very futurist creation, and no one would have seen how big a mobile phone would have been in the world, in part of all of our lives, that these days a lot of us are trying to figure out how to slowly part ourselves from them a little bit more. When you were working on that, what did it feel like to work in an industry that was as yet unknown?
It was a fascinating roller coaster ride in that emerging industry. We didn't know at the beginning it would become the smartphone industry. To start off with, it was simply mobile computing. In other words, it was taking the possibilities of computers, which were big mainframes, and then desktop computers, and hopefully enabling more normal people, as we sometimes call them, normal people. We referred to our aunts or our grandfathers using the software and enjoying using the software. We knew it could improve their lives in terms of managing their contacts, managing their schedule, being a place where they could consult notes, being a place where they could play games, access books. And only gradually we realized that the communication aspects would be particularly important. So this is before the time that the World Wide Web was well known. That came into people's minds about 1995. I started working at Psion, P-S-I-O-N, in 1988, so 7 years before. And the initial devices had limited connectivity. But over time we realized there is this thing called mobile phones, which more people are using. And they won't just be for voice calls. They will be for sharing information. They will be for connecting people into larger systems. Even then, we couldn't appreciate the full scale of the changes that were underway. We imagined that maybe 1 person in 10 might have a mobile phone, and of these, maybe 1 in 10 of these might be, we eventually called them smartphones. We had other names for them, which didn't quite stick.
What
like
were some of the other
wireless
names?
information device, WID, W-I-D. The term communicator, which had come from us watching Star Trek when we were younger, in which people did have a communicator, that sort of stuck for a while. But we realized in due course that actually maybe one day everybody in the world will have a smartphone. So about 2001, I started talking about smartphones for all, and it seemed completely foolish at the time. But if we fast forward to 2018, where I go around the world, it's a reality. Even in relatively poor, remote parts of the world, you see lots of people with smartphones. When I was in Kenya a few years ago on a safari, stopped at the roadside, again, that's what people wanted to talk about. And they wanted to show me their phones, talk about their experiences with mobile banking. So that vision, which we dared to think about, has become a reality even more fully than we expected. And the lesson I draw from that is that the long-term impacts of technology are often hard to see in advance. You mentioned at the beginning that to an extent some of us are now in a love-hate relationship with our smartphones. Sometimes they seem to dominate us. Sometimes we feel we need to go on digital detox. So that's an example of where, in a sense, we should have thought more about that in advance. People like Mark Zuckerberg, who created Facebook, said, well, this is a bit of fun. This will help people to join communities. Some of his lieutenants, some of his co-workers were a bit worried that they were knowingly messing with people's psychology, but they thought, what harm can come from it? And now many of them are saying, we should have thought harder about that. And some of the initial founders of Facebook say they are refusing to let their own children use social media. I think they've got a hard battle there, hard to stop youngsters getting onto social media. Again, I make the point that the implications of technology can be hard to anticipate, but actually we'd better improve our ability to anticipate. Otherwise, there may be more people saying, as some of the executives of Facebook are now saying, some of the former executives of Facebook are now saying, oh my God, what have we done?
Well, Steve Jobs also famously didn't let his kids play with iPhones and iPads.
That's right. And things need to be set in limits and in context. Some of these things are just so seductive. That's why you've got to stop children having too much sweets. It is our natural instinct from prehistorical days to have a sweet tooth. That made sense in evolutionary times. In the same way, we have instincts which draw us to the fascinations of what these devices can do. And we need to set up systems, either through society or through other processes, ethics, to constrain how much we spend on various things.
How much do you feel that is the responsibility of the companies creating the devices or the software or whatever the products are, or governments? Because often this sort of ends up on us, the consumer or the citizen or the human, as I prefer, for us to then be like, oh, okay, now there's something else we've got to manage, whether it's knowing how many preservatives, additives and sugar are in all of our food. So now we have to be much more careful of what we allow ourselves to eat. Now we have to be much more careful of how we use social media. We have to be much more careful of how much we allow technology and the radiation of the devices in our lives. It seems to fall more on us.
I don't think we can just leave it up to the companies in question. Companies have done tremendous things, but it's not always in their own short-term interest, at least, to slow things down. It's in the interest of YouTube, for example, to make people passionate when they watch the videos, because that keeps them watching longer and they get more money. YouTube gets more money from people clicking on ads or looking at ads at the bottom of the screen. More generally, corporations' interests don't always dovetail with what's best for citizens. And much though we might like them to pay more attention, they probably won't pay more attention unless society as a whole exerts pressure and raises an issue. Politicians can certainly help. The problem is that most politicians are, like the rest of us, bit struggling to make sense of all of these technological possibilities. So therefore, I say it's up to all of us. It's up to all of us to be involved in this conversation. This is too important a topic just to leave to any subset of society. It may feel overwhelming. We may as individuals feel, what can we do? Well, actually there is a conversation going on there, and we need to connect that conversation. We need to strengthen that conversation. We need to ensure that it's balanced, that it's not just an overreaction, a techlash, as people call it, the backlash against technology, which might then undo the good as well as preventing the harm. I see it as my own core mission now to improve the caliber of the conversation about the future, which we're all having, so that we're more aware of what might happen, what's realistically possible, as opposed to just some Hollywood screenwriter's fantasy. It might make a good entertainment, but it's not actually realistic anytime now. So let's figure out collectively, and let's become aware of what things are technologically possible. And then the second part of that conversation is, out of these possible futures, which of them are truly desirable? And often our instincts are not completely trustworthy guides to that decision. Our instincts are rooted in the past, and just as in the past it made sense for us to eat as much fruit, perhaps, as we could get a hold of, similarly some of our instincts will mislead us. We might say, wow, this would be wonderful, or we might have another three-letter word. Instead of wow, we might say, yuck, I hate this. And in each case, that instinct may mislead us. So we need to have a conversation that goes beyond the future shock and into kind of a more thoughtful discussion of, actually, this could be good for us. And this other scenario, which initially excited us, actually, it would be bad for us. Let's stop it before we go too far down that track.
Do you have any examples of where we've led with instincts and it's turned out not to be so good for us?
Well, I'll give you an example where the instincts changed. So back in the 1970s, people realized that it might be possible one day to create babies in test tubes. As it was talked about, that infertile couples might take advantage of this remarkable technology. And many people said this would be terrible. Various churches at the time said these creatures, if they're conceived in such a way, they wouldn't have souls. And in a more secular way, people said, if people find out they were conceived in such a way, they will feel distraught, they'll be psychologically adrift. Many politicians at the time said, we're suffering from a particular problem in the world, which is overpopulation. We shouldn't be spending lots of money on crazy technology, which is going to add to the burden of overpopulation. If a couple can't have children, they should just get used to that idea. Why don't they adopt instead? And even the medical profession were in many ways against the pioneering research of the people who were doing this work. They said they're just trying to play gods. They're just pursuing their own egos. So there was a lot of yuck. It's a terrible thing to create children in such an unnatural way. But then over time, when the first few test tube babies were born, Louise Brown here in Britain, people looked at them and said, they seem to have a soul after all, as much as anybody else has a soul. And they looked at the families where people had a lot of joy brought into their lives. And suddenly, quite soon, that feeling of instinct changed. There are other medical examples. The first time you heard about somebody having a heart transplant in the 1960s, again, people thought this is an obscene thing to do. Blood transfusion offended people in the same way. There are even some religions that say this is an anathema. The soul of the human or the life force of the human is in the blood. We shouldn't be mixing this. Is that really instincts? Well, it's what people used to think. There was probably good reasons for us to have these fears and these instincts. But if we think about it calmly, it is better if people have a heart transplant than they die through not having a heart.
Mm-hmm. And so we can't really know how we're going to feel about something in the future. How do we approach a kind of future idea?
We need to give it time. We need to talk it through several times over. We need to flesh out a scenario more fully, more realistically than just some science fiction story. And then we need to think it through and discuss, this would seem to be a problem with this scenario. I wouldn't like it. But maybe if this happened instead, it wouldn't be so bad. Good soap operas, good works of art can help to explore that. And people can change their minds. Another example of changing social attitudes was attitudes towards same-sex marriage. A long time ago, people felt really uncomfortable about it. And then people thought, well, I wouldn't mind it, but everybody else is going to be opposed to it. So, and then gradually through soap operas and other things, and through more people becoming aware of other same-sex relationships, most people overcame that yuck reaction. So that discussion helps. If you go back further in time, talking about mixed race communities, there were times in the southern states of America, go back to the 1920s and 1930s, if you asked an individual, would you mind having a person of colour coming and living in your community, they would often say, well, I wouldn't mind myself, but my neighbours wouldn't like it. And so probably we shouldn't do it. Because they didn't even know what their neighbours really thought. But over time, it became clearer that a large majority actually didn't mind. And so suddenly it became more feasible for these mixed communities to grow. And that instinct got overturned.
Mm-hmm. What is it that you see in the media and in Hollywood when it comes to sort of the way that we talk about the future that makes you feel kind of uncomfortable, that it's misleading?
Well, let's talk about Terminator, for example. This is a picture that accompanies almost every article in the newspapers about possibly the future of AI. You get this metallic monster. So that's one picture that people have of technology going wrong. And it's misleading in two key ways. The first is that in the Terminator stories, humans are able to overcome the artificial intelligence by exerting what we might call a superhuman effort. They manage to overcome it. I don't think that's at all realistic. If artificial intelligence really does decide that in the future that humans should be sidelined, we wouldn't have a chance to overcome it. So that's kind of a fantasy to portray. Other films that come to mind, Independence Day, I think it's when aliens came and were attacking the Earth, and somehow plucky humans managed to upload a virus into the alien computer and sabotage it. It's just assuming there's too much of a similarity between the human level and the alien level, or the human level and the super intelligence level. What's more likely to be is just to consider the attitude that humans have towards ants, say. So as intellectually, we humans might think ants are quite marvelous creatures. They create these wonderful social hierarchies. Then if humans are trying to build out a new suburb, got a new shopping complex, and you come across some anthills in the way, we don't think, oh, this is cute, let's work around them. We just obliterate them without hardly a moment's notice. And that's probably what an artificial intelligence that does happen to go wrong would do to humans, and we wouldn't have a chance. The other thing that's wrong with that scenario is figuring out why the artificial intelligence would turn against humans in the first place. And it's often implied that some of the artificial intelligence would have some of humans' bad characteristics, the alpha male streak, or it would just have some animal instinct which would cause it to fight against humans. The problem isn't if artificial intelligence would develop in such a nasty character. It's more that an artificial intelligence might be given a particular goal to accomplish, and that as far as that goal is concerned, we humans are irrelevant and we are a distraction rather than that we are something that the artificial intelligence hates. So this is part of exploring what the realistic scenarios are. And I see about 5 reasons to worry very much about what artificial intelligence of the future might do. One is that there may be bugs in the software. Second, very importantly, the software may not have any bugs at all. It may be implementing what we have asked it to do, but afterwards we think, actually, we shouldn't have asked it to do that. It's a little bit like the story of King Midas. Very simple story. King Midas said, I'd like some gold. I wish everything I touched would turn to gold. And then he realized, actually, he shouldn't have wished for that because his food turned to gold and his daughter turned to gold. And that's a very simple and crass story. No programmers of artificial intelligence are going to make a mistake quite as crass as that, but they might make a more subtle mistake. And after all, there are a kind of artificial intelligence already in the world which is following a particular algorithm to some detriment. I'm talking about corporations. Corporations are programmed, in a sense, to maximize profits, maximize returns to shareholders. And they do that very well. And sometimes we think, oh, I wish they weren't so good at doing it because they are ignoring externalities and they're overcoming democratic dissent and so on. So for that reason, also we should worry about artificial intelligence going wrong, because humans might not think through what we asked. It's a bit like the story of 3 wishes of a genie. In all of these stories, the third wish is, oh, I would like to undo the first 2 wishes because they were more complicated than I thought about.
Mm-hmm.
There are 3 other ways in which artificial intelligence could go wrong, but I just stop that point there. I just offer it as an example of where Hollywood can mislead us. On the other hand, there are some excellent stories around. The Channel 4 program that was shown worldwide on humans, in which families brought home robots to do some of the household chores. This was originally based on a similar series in Sweden. Thought that was very thought-provoking and not too out of the possibilities.
And as a futurist, it's not all technology and artificial intelligence. What are the other elements that we need to be more aware of?
Absolutely. The most important questions about technology, as the management guru Peter Drucker said, they're not technical questions but human questions. Whether or not we adopted test tube baby technology was down to human decisions in the end. We decided we liked it. And the influence over adoption of technologies will come very much through human values, as human values evolve. They'll come through legislation. Countries might decide to legislate against the likes of Uber and not have this kind of quite ruthless startup company apparently breaking rules in its pursuit of its own market share. So there's legislation, there's values, there's also subsidies. We may decide to invest more in developing various drugs, which in the short term there's no strong financial case for. There's such a thing as the Drugs for Neglected Diseases. There's a DNDI, the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, which looks at many of the diseases which mainly afflict people in very comparatively poor countries, diseases such as elephantitis and Chagas disease, and lots of others whose names are difficult to recall because in the rich Western world we don't get them. But they are affecting people, millions, tens of millions in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, and so on. But the drug companies don't invest a lot of money developing solutions for them because there isn't a particular financial benefit for them. But various governments around the world, Malaysia, Indonesia, some sub-Saharan governments are investing more in this. They're saying, we have to develop these solutions even though there's not a short-term market case for doing so.
So the question was more about what other elements of futurism are important for us to know about outside of technology?
Well, I would say, first of all, technology is going to be so transformative that it is important to come face to face with the full horrors and the full potential of what technology can do. It's a little bit like what I said at the very beginning about how much, in the end, smartphone technology changed the world, much more than those of us who were in the field from the beginning could foresee. In particular, I think artificial intelligence will change everything enormously. Every single employment, every single career, all areas of work and play, education, health will be changed by successive waves of new competence of artificial intelligence. Second, I would also want to emphasize the transformations in biotech. We will have new solutions available to healthcare, and we will have new ways to improve the body, new ways to improve the mind. So people already are sort of cyborgs in the sense they get artificial hips or artificial knees, or they get new lenses put in their eyes. Some cases we have pacemakers, some cases we have cochlear implants. In due course, we're going to have the possibility of extra brain cells being added in. In due course, we're going to be able to connect our brains directly onto the internet. So it's not just that the internet will come to our smartphones if we choose to look at them. The internet can be there in our subconscious if we want. So these changes are going to be more disruptive than anything that's happened in history. And we shouldn't lose sight of that.
How quickly are they coming?
So nobody can be sure how quickly these changes will come. But we can look at various scenarios. Again, this is what the futurists try and help people think through. And I would say there are definitely scenarios with about probability 50% that by the middle of this century, 2050, which will still be when many people listening to this podcast will hope to be in the primes of their lives, that by that stage there will be super artificial intelligence everywhere, and that will help us to have developed the abolition of aging, which means that if we wanted to, we could periodically refresh our bodies, get rid of the accumulated detritus of living, and become rejuvenated again. So there's about a 50% chance that may have happened by the middle of the century. There's also a 10% chance that may happen in about 10 years. And the reason I think this might happen is it could be driven by faster improvements in artificial intelligence than people are expecting. I say it's only a 10% chance, but we have seen in the last few years improvements in artificial intelligence have taken many people, even in the field, by surprise. People who were shocked at how good some of the results from deep learning were. Now, deep learning itself is overhyped in some ways. People imagine that by itself it's going to be able to solve more problems than it can. But it's an example of something that in about 2012, 2013 became much more capable than people had previously expected, and it's now being applied to many more fields than people had anticipated. So it's possible that in the next 5 years or so, there'll be other breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, which will then accelerate things even more than before. And once you get artificial intelligence itself involved in the designing the next level of artificial intelligence, there's a positive feedback loop. It's a bit like our tools. At first were very primitive throughout history, but by the time of the Industrial Revolution, we could build machines to improve our tools. And then the tools could improve the machines, and the machines could improve our tools, and that's the Industrial Revolution. Computers were first built by hand, using hammer and nails, effectively. If you see the film with Alan Turing, The Imitation Game, him in Bletchley Park during the wartime, that's what he seems to be doing, and apparently it's not too far from the truth. And computers were designed on paper and pencil. Now, computers can help design other devices, can help to manufacture other devices. You get computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing of computers. So computers help to improve computers, which is why computers are so much better all the time. In the same way, software is improved by people using software, and now increasingly artificial intelligence is being improved by people using artificial intelligence. So that feedback cycles can accelerate, and that's one reason why it's possible we will have these changes even in as little as 10 years. The other reason is because there's so much money involved, and so many companies can make so much money by making the first breakthroughs in the next level of artificial intelligence. If we look at the wealthiest companies in the world by share price valuations, it used to be, if you go back 10, 15 years, it used to be a mixture of different kinds of companies who were the most valuable. Companies like Exxon in the oil industry, companies like GE, General Electric, or financial companies like Citibank. But in the last 3 or 4 years, the most valuable companies have all been high-tech companies. Apple recently passed $1 trillion. Amazon then, a month later, also passed $1 trillion valuation. And interestingly, they had doubled their share price valuation from more than doubled it in just a single 12-month period. Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and then there are Chinese companies too who have similar valuations, particularly Tencent, who do WeChat, and Alibaba, who are an online shopping phenomenon. So there is so much money to be made by these technical breakthroughs in artificial intelligence in almost every field that so many people are working on it. And finally, there's another reason why progress in artificial intelligence is likely to speed up, and that's because of not a commercial battle, but a political battle. Vladimir Putin said last year, in response to some questions in an open forum, he said the country that achieves leadership in AI will rule the world. And he's probably right, because A company that really makes the breakthroughs in AI would be able, if they wish, to cyber attack their competitors and lock us down. If you think back to what allegedly North Korea did with hacking into Sony Pictures, when Sony Pictures a few years ago had this film about the North Korean leadership, which they disliked. There are already countries using cyber attacks on each other, on the infrastructure, and also using social media. If countries are able to do that at a higher level, they could indeed control the world. And the argument is, well, the Americans will say to each other, we don't necessarily want to control the world, but we want to be sure that the Chinese or the Russians don't control the world. Let's invest more. So that's why we may have faster changes in artificial intelligence than people generally expect, which is why it's all the more important to think through the other aspect of futurism, which is what happens to humans in all of this.
I want to dig into some of that, and there's quite a lot there. I guess this leads us to a place where we're going to need international bodies and treaties around how artificial intelligence and all this technology is used. Has that started?
Yes, it has started. It's not going fast enough, but let's be grateful. It has started. It's discussed at the World Economic Forum. It's discussed to an extent at the United Nations. Here in Britain, there is quite an impressive piece of work being done in the House of Lords. There is something called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on AI, which has brought together a lot of industry experts to try and think, what does the future of AI mean for Britain? And it's looking at some important topics like how do we need to change what's taught in schools and universities to educate people for the new skills that will be required in the future, given that artificial intelligence may change so many careers. So they're looking at that. They're looking at questions of bias in algorithms. How do we avoid trusting algorithms too much and then realizing that they've got hardwired biases in them? They're not yet, in my view, looking hard enough at the even bigger question of the existential threat that artificial intelligence might pose. But it is being discussed more and more. So that's good news. So the Oxford professor Nick Bostrom released a book about 3 or 4 years ago now called Superintelligence, when he wrote down many of the considerations carefully for the first time in a way that it's quite hard to read, but if you keep going, you can go all the way through it. And people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk read this book and said it deserves attention. And so many other people now picking this up. And people such as the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari has written about this increasingly as well. So more people are waking up to this possibility. Not enough in my view, and we're still too distracted by short-term issues.
As we're talking, I'm getting that sense of urgency of like, wow, this is really, it's just on our doorstep, it's happening already. If we're not more aware of it, if we're getting distracted by, I mean, there's a lot of things to get distracted by. Well, it's not even distractions, it's a lot of things to be aware of as a modern day human, that we could be left behind. And there is this question of tech elitism, of the people that already have money are the ones that get all of this first and get access to it. And that actually, if you're talking about in 10 years or 20 years, all of us being able to use technology to reduce our aging or to live longer or to heal our bodies, probably that's already starting now with certain humans. So then there's sort of a super elite human race that's being created. And so it's interesting, how and when does that become available to everyone, or do we accept that that's just how these advances happen?
I think this is an incredibly important conversation. I don't think we can take it for granted that the technology will become easily available to everybody. There are some futurists who say, don't worry, the prices of technology always come down. Smartphones as an example, initially they were very expensive. Now you can get a really good smartphone for much less than $100. Other things have come down in price too, like drones and 3D printers, even medical diagnosis involving genomic data analysis. It used to be incredibly expensive. It's now somewhere between $100 and $1,000 for a complete scan of your entire DNA, including recommendations. On the one hand, we might think, don't worry, there is this tendency built into technology to become cheaper and cheaper. But I don't think we can take that for granted. There are counterexamples. If we look at America, many of the prices of medical treatments have gone up rather than gone down. Insulin is costing a lot more in real terms in America than it did in the past. And more generally, there is a growing inequality of wealth between how much share of the national income is received by the 1% or the 0.1% and everybody else. And there's plenty of evidence that this inequality is growing. And there are reasons you can look at as to why it's likely to grow. And the companies that are successful nowadays aren't just successful locally. Once upon a time, there might have been, say, piano manufacturers in every city in the country. But then it turns out that the best piano manufacturer can transport the pianos more easily around the country. So the number of successful piano manufacturers will go down because you would choose the one who could really do the best job. That's one example people have looked at. There's this superstar effect that if you can get the best technology from anywhere in the world, you will choose that rather than going with the second or third best, which happens to be local. So there are a number of factors, including growing adoption of international standards, including the fact that many of the new breakthroughs require a lot of people to make them happen. They might be based on an individual's breakthrough idea, but to turn it from a theoretical idea into a practical reality requires huge amounts of people working together, which only the rich companies can afford. So the trend is that the very wealthy companies, some of whom we mentioned earlier in this discussion, will become yet more wealthy. They'll become the most powerful forces that ever existed on the planet. The Apples, Amazons, Googles, perhaps also the Chinese equivalents, will be much more powerful than most of the countries in the world. And so there is a risk that we won't automatically get the sharing of the high-tech technologies with everybody. And it may be the case that the proper rejuvenation treatments will be very expensive. There is a genetic enhancement that can be applied just now, which a very small number of people have taken, that extends the telomeres, which is something at the end of the chromosomes in blood. So as cells divide, the chromosomes get recreated, one going into each of the new cells, but part of the chromosome doesn't get fully copied. It's the bit at the end, which is called the telomere. So after a certain number of divisions, it's called the Hayflick number, it's about 40 or 50, something like that, the cells can no longer divide. But there is an enzyme which can extend the length of these telomeres. It's a natural enzyme, it's called telomerase. It seems to operate in certain parts of the human body at certain times, but not at the rest. Well, nowadays you can have a genetic viral treatment that will extend the telomeres throughout your blood. But it's extremely expensive currently, well over $1 million. And so it's not the kind of thing that a doctor can prescribe. The hope is that people will find ways of making it happen more cheaply, but it's not obvious that it will. So we do face a scenario in which only the wealthy are able to benefit from some of these technologies, particularly technologies that might enhance their minds. And once their minds are enhanced, they'll be able to do even more, perhaps.
Well, even now, a lot of people just go to the doctor, take what they're prescribed, have painkillers, all of this kind of way of treating illnesses, or of course the well-being movement has risen. But I'm aware of lots of other things that are available, such as NAD on intravenous drips, which sort of really gives your whole system and on a cellular level a boost. Costs about $5,000 for a treatment. This is what a lot of people, such as pop stars and those that are running around that have money, are already doing and have been doing for years. It does show that we're already so behind, most of us, in terms of what you refer to as normal people, in terms of what we're doing. I don't know what that means. But
well, we should have the discussion about it.
Yeah.
We should point out that it's by no means inevitable that we will have things shared freely, and we have to take sometimes political action, akin to the DNDI, the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, which said, no, we can't just rely on market forces to make this happen. We as politicians have to step in to make sure that these drugs are available for these diseases that afflict so many people in the developing world. But there are other treatments people talk about. There are, in some parts of California, treatments where you get parts of young people's blood transfused into you, because it does seem that in some circumstances, this young blood provides a sense of rejuvenation. Even objectively, people reported that their grey hairs turned black again. So it's early days to understand, and maybe things like NAD, which you mentioned, or there may be other factors which can be understood and then isolated and then hopefully manufactured on bulk more cheaply and made available to everybody. But unless we are aware of it and campaigning for it, this may not happen.
But as soon as you say, young blood, I'm just now seeing the dark side of that, which is already happening. Already, kids are going missing all over the world for organ transplants. I wouldn't be surprised, I don't have journalistic reports, but having worked with some people that run children's homes and orphanages in Asia, I know that there are kids that are sitting locked up around the world, giving blood, giving organs to wealthy Westerners that want that rejuvenation. So,
of course, we must condemn that very strongly. We must also think, is this a legitimate desire for people to be rejuvenated? And this is where the other aspect of futurism comes in. It's not just what's possible, but what's desirable.
So the role of ethics and morals.
That's right. Are we going to condemn these people for wanting to live longer? Or are we going to say, you know what, it's a basic human right to live longer. Let's ensure it happens to everybody. And I'm very much in that latter camp. I think that the most important right of all is the right to life and the right to healthy life. And that this can be obtained by suitable rejuvenation technologies which are on the point of being researched, developed and deployed if we organise society in such a way to make that happen.
And even at the cost of other lives?
No, it shouldn't be at the cost of anybody's lives. It should be something that is available worldwide. But it's not going to happen automatically. It's not going to happen by default.
But in a capitalist world, we already know that the technology that we're enjoying is at the cost of others' lives in terms of the modern day slavery that we have that is responsible for a huge amount of the technology production.
So sometimes capitalism is win-win. Sometimes the third world countries that do the work to create the products, they benefit too. People are very happy to go and work in these factories because their lives are, for a while at least, better than what they had previously. So sometimes it's possible for capitalism to lift everybody's boats. But there's no iron law that says that always happens. And there are certainly plenty of cases when people, instead of having win-win, have a kind of win-lose situation. Some people win and others lose. It's more of a zero sum. We have to understand what's the difference between the two cases. We have to understand that we actually need to genuinely create something new rather than just redistributing what's there already.
I feel like there's something in trying to understand perspective from other people's shoes, because most people that listen to the show, I mean, we've got listeners in 119 countries, but I'm sure that we don't yet have listeners that are listening on their way to work in the Apple factory in China where there's suicide nets outside their windows. Most of us listening can't imagine what it's like to go to work and have suicide nets just be like a normal part of our working life in the same way that a coffee machine is. There's a long way of understanding the morality of what we're creating on a global level and what that really means.
Some of these companies in China are improving matters quite considerably. So Foxconn, who did have many of these issues, are taking humanitarian steps to ensure that their workers have a more fulfilled life and they're less likely to want to commit suicide.
But it's slow, and I know from the work that I've done in sustainable fashion that the reports and the reality of how things are improving often don't add up.
Yes.
that actually the media attention means that the factories have to show face of improvements, and actually that brings more fear into the workplace, because then the workers have to also prove that they're happy when they're not. Otherwise they lose their jobs or they get into more trouble. And, you know, in the fashion industry, often young women are force-fed contraceptives, all kinds of things to keep producing. I find this a really difficult issue, because even though I know all of this, I don't know the ethics of the recorder and the microphones that we're using to record this interview. As I look around, I do have an iPhone and a Mac computer, which I know are complicit in these issues, as well as the mining of the precious metals. I've looked into getting a Fairphone. Everyone's advised me that they're not really ready yet, but they don't really compete yet with what we're used to. They also say that they're not fair. They're the fairer phone and they're doing everything that they can, but they actually can't make a fully fair phone.
I think our individual actions do make a difference, but the bigger difference will come through coordinated political action. Mm-hmm. So we should absolutely discuss these issues. We shouldn't let people airbrush them away or use some kind of whitewashing to pretend that they've solved them when they haven't really addressed it. So these issues must be emphasized, but nor should we just say, let's stop all these factories altogether. And nor should we say either that this means that this issue of factory suicide should drive out all the discussion about bigger issues in these countries. Because although there are too many people committing suicide, there are still many more people in all these countries dying of old age. And I would see that as the biggest win of all, if we can apply artificial intelligence and biotechnology to stop people having to go through the downward spiral of old age, decrepitude, and eventual death.
As soon as you say that, for some reason, I then get a picture of humans being sort of imprisoned into manufacturing slavery for hundreds of years, because they're sort of given rejuvenation technology in order to keep producing and doing their jobs.
So I would say that's a scenario we can discuss briefly, but I don't think it's at all credible, because the same technologies that will do these other things will enable all of these factory work to be done entirely automation by robots. So anything that the humans are being bent over backwards to do now will almost certainly be done in the same timescales as these other scenarios by automation. So humans in that situation will no longer have to work in such miserable circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you, so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty. How quickly is technology and AI going to change the workplace as we know it? And I'm kind of like coming back now more into this country, into America, the people who are listening to our show. How much is this going to change their jobs?
Well, I think that all jobs will be changed within 20 years. Many jobs will be changed within 5 or 10 years. When I say changed, I don't mean necessarily the job will cease to exist. I mean that what people do in the jobs will be quite different. Even something like a doctor. There's a great deal of knowledge involved in being a doctor. more of it can be done automated, collecting data and keeping up to date with all the latest theories about various diseases, the latest treatments that are available. And so that part of the doctor's work can be done in the near future more reliably, less expensively by algorithms. Even the work of a nurse, which is a lot of human aspects, holding somebody's hand, reassuring them when they're about to get a painful injection, helping them through that and so on. Even some of that can be done by artificial intelligence too, which has an emotional aspect to it. This is something I don't think people anticipate coming as quickly as they should. So I think there are scenarios in which many of these changes will apply to almost every career within the next 10 and 20 years. What's the reaction? Some people try and stop it, say, well, let's legislate so that we're not going to have automation. Other people say, well, we have to learn new skills. We all have to teach everybody how to code. I don't think that's good enough either, because in the future, most coding will be done by artificial intelligence too. Most important skills are agility, which means that we can change more quickly rather than being stuck into very long courses of projects, and emotional intelligence, in which we're able to find, well, emotional intelligence, of course, means many, many things, but in part it's about being more comfortable with not having work, that our futures will depend on us living without working, without having paid work at least. And we have to change society in anticipation of that too. Some people will say, don't worry, every time there's been an industrial revolution, there's always been more jobs created than were destroyed. Whole new jobs were created that people never imagined. So I was a software engineer for many years. If you go back to the 1930s and talk to my grandparents, predict that their grandson would be a software engineer, they wouldn't have a clue what was being spoken about. Tell them that one of their great-grandchildren would be a neural network engineer, they'd have even less of an idea. But this assumes that there's more things that humans can do which can't be done by automation. And in the past that was correct, because humans had still parts of their ability which AI couldn't do. But increasingly AI will do many of the big thinking work, the abstracting work, the joining the dots work, the creativity, and even the simulation of compassion and care. So all jobs will be impacted. Perhaps a very small minority of people will still have jobs, but they will be something like 1%. And 99% will end up without work. Yuval Noah Harari, who I mentioned earlier, the Israeli historian, says that the scenario in the not too distant future where humanity bifurcates into the near gods and the mainly useless, that those who are fortunate enough to have good jobs in this future will have so much power at their hands that we'll be able to do all the kinds of things that the Greek gods of old aspired to. Things like effective immortality, omniscience, creation of life and death. Whereas most people they'll have nothing to offer society. So if they go trying to look for a job, there'll be nothing for them to do. In the past, people would go and enlist in the army. But in the future, we won't need humans in armies because they'll all be done by technology. Society in the past had a reason to provide a national health service for everybody, not just for moral grounds. It's because they needed the population as a whole to be healthy, to do great things for the country. But in the future, that need won't be there. So that scenario is something that I think everybody needs to think about. And the reason I paint it is I do think it's a credible scenario. And we need to then anticipate how do we create the new social contract to look after people, and how do we change people's thinking about themselves so they no longer think about themselves as, well, I'm not working, therefore I'm a failure, I'm a third-class citizen. Instead, we will find other things to do with our time, the creative work, the exploration work. And I look forward to exploring so much music that I know exists, but I haven't had a time to listen to. I look forward to exploring my first love, Lady Mathematics. There's so much of mathematics that I never had the time to get my head around. I could probably spend years, decades, even centuries getting my head around all the mathematics. And then there's all the drama, all the box sets, the Mad Max, the Mad Men and Breaking Bad and 101 other amazing bits of drama. And then there's getting to meet incredible people all around the world. So that's what I look forward to doing. And that will be possible provided society ensures that the benefits of technology, the incredible benefits of technology, enable a sustainable superabundance rather than just enabling a utopia for the 1%.
Right. So there's two scenarios, and one is that artificial intelligence is kind of running the world and the rest of us are kind of in poverty, essentially. We've got time on our hands, but we don't have money. And
then we may have everything that we need, though.
Well, and then the other scenario is that our society looks after us. So whether it's sort of a universal basic income or something like that, yes, and that we have places to live and we have food, then we have time, and that time can be spent doing all the things that we dream about doing while sitting, looking.
That's right. The things that we think we'll do when we retire,
yeah,
or when we have long sabbaticals.
Yeah,
we'll be able to go on lengthy sabbaticals in outer space, in inner space, exploring the earth, exploring culture.
And then we can all be creating more arts, yeah, and singing together as communities and creating theatre and all of these wonderful things.
That's right. We can only glimpse it vaguely, but we can see enough of that possible future to realise actually that would be a genuinely good future.
I'm just giving this a little bit more time just because I know it's a little bit, we went into the dark quite heavily. So I want to allow some impressions of how this could actually lead us to an advancement of society that allows more space for the humanness of us to flourish.
No, and thanks for doing that. And if you asked me at the beginning what's my probabilities I give to these various scenarios, I think that the sustainable superabundance is about 60% likely, and the collapse of society, the new dark age, is about 30% or 35% likely. So I'm more optimistic than pessimistic on that simple count. But that probability, 35% of a social chaos, is far too high for me to keep quiet about it. I want people to know about it so that they pay attention to it. But equally, you're right. I'd like people to know about the credible picture of a sustainable superabundance, which is within our grasp, in which we will live without many of the constraints which have held humanity back throughout all of our history.
I think there's also a question of, does the whole of humanity go in one direction, or will it depend on what nation state you're part of? Will different countries choose a very different approach? Or will there be almost different layers of society where different communities go in very different directions, and you can almost choose which community you want to be part of, in the same way now that you choose who you hang out with based on similar interests, the music that you like, or your beliefs in the world. It might become like that, where you either find yourself forced somewhere, or you can choose who and where and which belief system you want to live in.
I'm a big fan of diversity. I think that's one of the most important human characteristics as we foresee desirable scenarios in the future. Anything that doesn't have diversity in it is a big no for me. There will be diversity within various overall parameters. So today we've got diversity of, for example, the Amish communities in the eastern states of North America, which have various rules that they have in which they don't use various bits of technology. Another community that's interesting is some of the community of Orthodox Jews in Israel. Many of the menfolk there don't work. They spend their time in meetings discussing the Torah and all the possible implications of it. And they are supported in part by the state and in part by their wives and other people working. It seems that they're very fulfilled and that they're actually quite happy with that, even though they don't have a huge amount of personal possessions compared to others. I think we should encourage and support and fight for diversity in the future, but it wouldn't be able to impose rules on the rest of the world. So if a particular part of the world said, you know what, female education is an abomination in my religion, I'm going to stop females being educated anywhere, then we would say, no, that's not acceptable. So there might be some ground rules which we would say, no, we couldn't do this. If there's a community that says apostates should be executed because it's, again, an abomination, I would say no. That's not something that society as a whole should tolerate. Society should put down rules and say, well, you can do what you like, but you can't execute people for being an apostate, and you can't deny the girls in your community the right to a fair education. That's going too far. Where these boundaries lie is something we should spend a lot of time discussing.
It's where we are now. There are many different views, ways of being around the world. There are many campaigns and advocacies for things that some people believe should be universal human rights and others don't. And so maybe that will not discontinue, because that's a very human problem.
I think we can get better at understanding our differences rather than just saying, well, I think this and this is what I deem to be true, and you obviously seem to have a different viewpoint and we're never going to be able to reconcile it. I think we will get better at understanding the reasons why we have various feelings and instincts. And in the end, we may be able to come up with creative solutions that allow some of the most horrible tensions to be dissolved.
And perhaps with the biohealth technology, if more and more of us are being exposed to that, where the trauma or the discomfort sits in our body, that can lead to some of these thoughts and practices and desires to exert power over others, that could shift as well.
I think that's very important. So even more important, arguably, than healing the body is healing the mind. Epidemic of depression and suicidal tendencies, which we have in many parts of the world. Many people with huge chips on their shoulders, which drive them in ways that they're only dimly aware of often, to support various causes. So if there's more mindful awareness of this, if people can be led by skilled coaches, whether they're human coaches or increasingly artificial intelligence coaches, they'll be led to an appreciation of, well, I'm like this and I feel very strongly about this, but actually, I'm not sure I really want to feel so strongly about it. And okay, and then they'll be reintegrated. They'll be made whole again in a way that's not possible without that intervention and without that help. So technology will lead us not just to having rejuvenated bodies, in my view, but rejuvenated minds, rejuvenated emotions, rejuvenated spirits. And we'll more readily get to the higher states of consciousness that people occasionally glimpse and occasionally talk about, but still very rare. And we will be more of the time at these higher levels of consciousness.
So in this super abundant scenario, we are also feeling very fulfilled on an inner level and kind of operating at a very kind of shiny, enlightened aspect of ourselves.
That's the vision. I don't see why not. People have been able to reach that level in history from time to time. We need to understand better what it is that enables people to reach that level. And maybe we can shortcut it, so you don't have to spend so many years cross-legged under a particular tree saying a particular mantra or koan. There may be other ways to get there more quickly. And I don't think that's cheating. I think that's something that's very good and very important. I wouldn't want to say that it's a state in which there's no challenges anymore. I think there will be still challenges and goals. There will be great projects, there will be great endeavors, great journeys of exploration, but there won't be overwhelming challenges which cause people to not be able to cope with them.
Wow, well, yeah, the future is beautiful if we go that way.
The future can be even more beautiful than we currently conceive it. Imagine apes gathering 5 million years ago, talking amongst themselves in ape language. What might happen if their brains were enhanced, if their brains grew larger? Imagine them trying to contemplate the future. They might think dimly, well, we apes like bananas, maybe in the future there'll be more bananas. They would not be able to conceive of the beauties of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, of the moons of Jupiter, of Pythagoras' theorem, of a great drama. In the same ways, we can only glimpse I believe, what will happen as technology takes us from humanity to humanity plus, to this sustainable superabundance. We should try and glimpse it. We should try and figure it out, just in case there are parts of it which mislead us into thinking it's more attractive than it objectively is. But on the whole, I think this is a tremendously positive future, or in your words, a tremendously beautiful future.
Right, we would have to manage the darkness, the shadow of that scenario very skillfully.
Yes. We're only going to get to that humanity 2.0 by using the very best of humanity 1.0.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I almost want to finish there because it's a nice place to land. But I have one question from way earlier on that's still sitting with me. Why do we want the internet in our heads, like actually in our bodies?
Well, sometimes, as I'm speaking to you now, for example, I'm aware that I couldn't remember all the details. I talked about the number of times a cell could divide. I could remember the name of that limit, but I couldn't remember for sure what that number was. I just like that popping up in my mind. It'd be like Google Maps in our mind. Google Maps shows us what's a sensible way to get from A to B in the geographical space. And sometimes, although we're used to going left at this junction, today it's better to go right, because it turns out there's a terrible obstruction left that we don't know about. So Google Maps in our brain might be a bit like that. It might help us to get from A to B spiritually, or in terms of our life's goals. It might just say to us more quickly, actually, there's a person over there you really need to go and talk to now. They may not look like the kind of person you think you'd like to talk to, but actually there's a very important connection about to be formed. Now, we wouldn't want that dominating us. We wouldn't want that as controlling us, but we'd like that information to be there and at our disposal, perhaps. And I'd like it to be there sometimes as well to stop me doing really foolish and stupid things. It might occasionally just nudge me and say, David, you've talked about this for too long. David, remember to smile. David, you're being biased again, in a nice way. So that's the kind of angel in my mind that I look forward to. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, if it's not really an angel, if it's owned by some corporation which pretends to be on my side but is actually just trying to make as much money as possible, it'll be more like an evil demon in our minds than an angel, which is why we need to discuss it carefully. But if we get it right, then this technology will help us to be the best versions of ourselves that we can be.
It would have to change quite a lot, because already I feel like, oh, but privacy, there would be no privacy. And even now, I'm aware that my phone is recording things that I'm not asking it to. And I'm aware that if I don't have the camera covered up on my computer, I feel very exposed. And so there is a sense of, wow, if that was all happening like inside of me, that everything's exposed.
Quite. And I think this is a very important question. Some people say, let's just get over it. Privacy is gone. I don't accept that. I think there are many things that we would want to keep private. We wouldn't want to become generally known, especially when we're experimenting with new ideas, especially when we are just toying with changing our philosophy. We wouldn't necessarily want everybody to know, oh, this person, lifelong vegan, is toying with becoming a meat eater again, or whatever, until we finally decided that new change of life would be right for us.
Right, but then there is a scenario when privacy doesn't exist that's actually quite interesting, because then we're actually fully authentic, and everyone is. It's not that some people are hiding more than others, or some people are presenting a certain version of themselves more than others. It actually sort of levels out the playing field and makes everything available and therefore everything normal.
This is the Panopticon Vision. People talk about it. David Brin, the science fiction writer, has addressed this, I think, in some of his work. I wish I had more time to read it and catch up with it. I think it's worth exploring that too. So maybe that is a better future. My instinct says yuck, but maybe I need to suspend that and explore it more fully. For the time being, I think privacy deserves to be protected, and we need to be ensure that our technology, when it does know about us, that it's keeping that to itself rather than sharing it with other third parties.
Yes, I agree for now. absolutely. But I'm also now slightly open to a world with no shame, with nothing to hide, because everything's just out there.
Well, let's discuss this again in 50 years' time and see whether we're still keeping secrets or not.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I guess we're going to get to discover how much of what we think is innately human really is in a new version of humans in Humanity 2.0. If it's just natural to need secrets, or if actually there could be no need for them.
Well, arguably, in prehistoric time, there were no secrets anyway. Everybody knew everything about everybody in the local community. It's only because we're in much larger communities now that we tend to keep things more secret from each other. So that may not be deeply innate. That may be something we have learned to value for either good or bad reasons.
And because of class, because of mobility, because of these ideas of perfectionism and media that we have become more protective over what we share.
Yeah.
And also more open. I find all of these things to be such paradoxes.
So we need to consider carefully which part of our current values do we want to uphold, and which part do we want to say, you know what, this is no longer appropriate in the new world, in a new society. That's quite a disturbing conversation to have at first, but we need to have the confidence to have that conversation.
It feels like philosophy lessons for everyone are an important aspect of moving forward.
Absolutely. So some people say, let's focus just on STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and maths. I always push back at that and say, at the very least, we must have an A in that acronym, an A for arts, or people will say arts and humanity. So not STEM, but STEAM. The ability to... Well, the fact is that many of these philosophers in olden times and more recent times have thought through some of these issues already before. And they've already seen some of the kind of elementary mistakes that people can fall into. So let's at least have these discussions. Let's be enabled by that. So I think it is true that we will get better foresight by having better hindsight. We'll be more likely to end up with a beautiful future if we understand the concerns that people have talked about throughout history. In a sense, I can sympathize with the Orthodox Israelis I mentioned earlier reading the Talmud, because they don't just read the Talmud, they read the commentaries on the Talmud, and they read the commentaries on the commentaries on the Talmud. I think we need to be familiar with some of the key historical arguments about values. We also need to bring ourselves up to date with what the community of modern day philosophers is thinking about this. I look at various communities. There are some studying existential risks, some funded by Elon Musk and others. There's also a community called transhumanists who have thought long and hard about, well, maybe humans in our present nature isn't the end state of evolution. Maybe we should be going beyond that. And so for at least 20 years, a group of people called transhumanists have been having exactly that discussion. So I want more people to become aware of that discussion. Not necessarily they're going to agree with it, but by seeing it, it will help them to make more informed decisions about what would be in a really beautiful future.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, David. It's been really interesting.
I'm sorry there was a lot on the doom and gloom, but I think we need to have that doom and gloom in mind to give us more of a sense of urgency, to think, let's find something better. But the good news is there are vastly better scenarios ahead too, which can come about, but only if we have these conversations.
I agree. I feel like we can't focus on blind optimism. The only way to create something beautiful is to fully understand and acknowledge the darkness and the light opportunities that lie ahead, so that we can learn how to navigate this with some skill.
It's only with an awareness of the shadow that we can really move into the brilliance of the sunlight.
Absolutely. And so if we want to find more from you and find out how to come to your events, it's londonfuturist.com.
Londonfuturist.com is the site where some of my events are publicized. You can also find me on Twitter as @DW2. It's a bit of a mathematical joke in that, referring back to my first love, to @DW2, which is DW squared. And that's where I will also be sharing my ongoing understanding, hopefully my improving understanding of some of the themes we've been talking about today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?